1881, at the end of October, last day of October. There was a family living in the area in the mountains known as Pole Creek in the western part of Buncombe County. His dad, his name was Eddie Cole, his wife Nancy, and they had two daughters. The oldest daughter was 10. Her name was Maddie. They had a younger daughter, she was 6, and her name was Gretchen. And when they got up that morning, Gretchen wasn't feeling well. So her mother said, well, maybe you should stay in bed. And she checked her, and sure enough, she had a little fever. And at lunchtime, she went to check on her, and her fever was worse. And by dark, her fever was raging. So Nancy told her husband, Eddie, she said, I don't know what to do but for you to hitch up the wagon and go to the top of the mountain and find Granny Presley's place and get one of her cures. Eddie agreed. He walked to the window and looked out, and there was a full moon just coming over Hooker's Gap. And the last leaves from the dogwood were flying across the face of the bone white moon, and it looked like the bats that left his barn every night. And a shiver ran through him. But he was a grown man, and he wasn't afraid of the dark. And his older daughter, came to him and said, Dad, can I go with you? And he said, no, you don't need to be out on a night like this. She said, but I don't want you to be out alone. He said, okay, you can come. She said, can I bring the lantern? He said, oh, I don't think we'll need it. There's a full moon. She said, okay, and she followed him to the barn, and they walked into the barn, and they got Tom and Willie, the two mules, and he hitched them to the wagon, and he climbed aboard and reached down his hand and helped her up to the seat, and she sat down beside him, and she nestled up close to him because it was cold, the wind was blowing. They started up the Gap Road. The wagon clunked along, wheels knocking against rocks and jarring along the old wagon road across the top of the mountain. And as they were going along, Maddie looked at her dad and said, it's kind of spooky out here, isn't it? He said, oh, there's nothing to be afraid of. And about that time, they heard, and Maddie said, what was that? And her dad said, I haven't heard that sound since I was about your age. She said, what was it? He said, I think that was a catamount. She said, well, what's a catamount? He said, well, some people call him a painter. Some call it a mountain lion. A big cat that used to live in this part of the world, but I thought they'd all been hunted out. He said, the last time I heard that, I was coming across this road with your grandfather. We'd taken a load of corn to a fella over in the Lester community and wound up staying longer than we planned. And when we started back across the mountain, one of the back wheels of your granddaddy's old wagon came loose, and by the time we got the wheel back on the wagon, it was dark. And as we passed over the top of the mountain, we heard that same sound, and I asked my dad, what's that? He said, I don't know. I haven't heard that sound in years. It might be a catamount. Well, they started on up the road, and she said, well, weren't you scared when you heard that sound back when you were my age? And he said, oh, yeah. He said, I was scared. I was so scared I almost jumped out of the wagon. But I'm glad I didn't, because if I'd have jumped out on one side, I would have gone off the side of the mountain. If I jumped off the other, I would have probably hit my head on one of these boulders that comes down into the trail. And she looked, and sure enough, there was a big rock formation sticking out. And when she looked at it, she thought, it looks like an old woman leaning on a stick. But as they got closer, of course, it was only a rock. And they got to the top of the mountain. There on the Gap Road, just as they crossed over to the other side of the mountain, there was a little trail that led off to the very peak of the mountain. And Eddie said, well, this is where we have to turn to go to Granny Presley's place. So he pulled the mules around to the right and he said, "Gee there, boys, gee." And the mules didn't want to turn up that road. So he whipped them on the butt with the reins and he said, "Gee now, boys, get up that road." So the mules slowly turned and they started up that road. Well, they'd gone just maybe an eighth of a mile when a laurel thicket sort of closed in around the wagon. And just as they got into the laurel thicket, they heard behind them, well, Maddie was so scared she climbed right into her daddy's lap and she said, Did you hear that behind us? And he said, yeah, but it's nothing to be afraid of. So the mules just barely moving through the laurel thicket when Ed stopped. He said, "Whoa, boys." She said, "Dad, what's wrong?" He said, I don't know. Something feels odd to me. Do you feel something odd?" And Maddie said, "I felt something odd since we left the house." And about that time, behind him, he heard, "What are you doing on my road tonight, Ed Cole?" And he turned around, and he could see two greenish eyes looking at him. And he said, Is that you, Granny Presley?" She said, "Who else do you think would be standing in the back of your wagon on a night like this on my road?" He said, well, we were coming to your house to try to get you to make a potion for my youngest daughter. She has a bad fever." And Granny Presley said, "Well, I don't normally do no doctoring on this night." And he said, but she's very sick." Granny Presley said, "Well, you may as well go on up to my place, 'cause you can't turn your wagon around here." And Ed said, "Okay, we'll go on to the top of the mountain." And he whipped the mules on the butt with his reins. And Maddie turned around and looked, and the back of the wagon was empty. Well, they bounced along for another half mile, and finally they could see at the crest of the mountain a glow where a large bonfire was burning. And as they pulled up into the clearing, they saw a little shack there, and there in the doorway of the shack stood the old granny woman. Well, Maddie said, "How did she get there before us?" He said, "I don't know." Well, Granny Presley walked out into the yard. She said, "You may as well turn your team around, 'cause there's no time for you to stay here." He said, "What about the potion?" She said, "Oh, I have the potion. I have it here in my hand." And she opened her hand, and there was a small leather bag there. She said, "Have you brought silver?" And Eddie said, "Yes, ma'am." And he reached into the pocket of his overalls and he pulled out a silver dollar and he held it up into the firelight. And when he did, Maddie looked up at it and the eagle winked at her. She could swear the eagle winked at her. Suddenly the coin flew from her daddy's hand into the old woman's hand. She caught it between her thumb and her little finger. She turned it in the firelight and then she threw it high into the air. And Maddie watched it turn head over tails, higher and higher into the smoke, until suddenly a large black bat swept out of the woods, grabbed the coin, and was gone quicker than it takes to tell. Maddie said, "That's the most amazing thing I've ever seen. Is it a pet?" The old granny woman laughed and said, "No, it's not a pet. Maddie said, "The children down below say you're a witch. Is it right?" And the old granny woman just laughed and she said, "People below, what do they know? They don't know black from white, and certainly not tonight." Maddie said, "Well, are you going to give us the potion now that we've given you your silver?" She said, "Look in the pocket of your apron, girl." Maddie reached into her pocket, and there was the leather bag. Granny took her stick and drew a circle on the ground, spit in it, turned around once and said, "Begone, mules," and the mules started back down the hill. Just then the fire started to glow higher and higher, and the smoke started to circle the fire. And just as the wagon started to crest the hill, Maddie looked back, and it looked almost like Indians sitting around that campfire. But as the smoke began to whirl higher and higher, she could see that it wasn't Indians at all. It was a deer and a possum and a red squirrel and a gray squirrel and a wolverine. And there on a stump leaned the old woman's walking stick, and sitting on the stump was a large black cat. And just as they disappeared over the hill, they heard, "Ow!" And that's the story of Maddie and the Granny Woman.